The NHL trade deadline has come and gone, and for anybody looking forward to some fireworks of some big deals going down, well, unless the Taylor Hall trade from the night before did it for you, it was a rather underwhelming trade deadline. All we really saw teams doing was trading around depth players and draft picks, which from a headline producing point of view is not particularly interesting. But when it comes to the Seattle Kraken, who will be picking from those depth pieces in just a few months when it comes to the expansion draft, things definitely were a little bit more interesting on the Seattle end. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Now, as you have likely picked up on at this point, this particular Seattle expansion draft video is not going to be talking about one specific team or doing a mock draft or anything like that. Instead, we're going to be looking at the impact that this trade deadline had on the protection lists and potential available players of the teams that were involved. So again, I won't necessarily be talking about each individual trade or necessarily who I think won those trades. Instead, we are very much focusing on the impact that this has on the expansion draft. So if you have been watching at least some of the videos in my series about the expansion draft so far, this is where I'm going to be doing some of those updates that I kept talking about once that trade deadline did come. So we may as well start with the team that I started this series with in the first place, in the Anaheim Ducks. Now, for the Ducks, not a lot has changed since I talked about this team for the first time back in January. As far as the trade deadline is concerned, they were involved in a couple of trades. Really, the only one of note here would be the fact that they picked up Hayden Fleury from the Hurricanes in exchange for Yanni Hakanpää and a 6th round pick in 2021. Hakanpää was never really a player that I had much on the radar as far as a potential pick that the Kraken could have from the Ducks. Meanwhile, Fleury definitely could be a player that the Kraken at least look at. Now, he has had quite a bit of hype in the last couple of years, but didn't really live up to much of that this season with the Hurricanes, which is probably why he found himself on the trading block. It also could, and at least to me, probably does mean that he isn't the most likely option that the Kraken would go with from the Ducks, but he still is maybe at least a bit of a dark horse and a potential player that once again they could look at. But at the very least, I think it's fairly safe to say that he probably doesn't change much as far as their protection list is concerned. The same though can definitely not be said for the Los Angeles Kings, who got things started a little bit early when a couple of weeks ago they traded a 4th round pick to the Rangers for Brendan Lemieux. As far as trades are concerned, that is where they stopped, although they did extend Iafallo during the trade deadline today, and their protection list definitely does need some updating from when I did that video. Originally, back in January on the forward end, I had the Kings protecting Kopitar, Anderson, Iafallo, Wagner, Kempe, Grundstrom, and Lizotte. But now, based on how the season has gone so far for some of the Kings players, and also the acquisition of Lemieux, I do think that there are some changes that are going to be made here, at least at the moment. For one, I do think that Lemieux probably gets one of the protection spots on the forward end at this point, especially considering they just gave up a 4th round pick for him. And on top of that, a pretty good season so far out of Andreas Athanasiou, who has 17 points in 32 games with 9 goals and 8 assists. Probably has him getting another one of these protection slots on the forward end that I previously had going to a different player. As far as where those two spots come from, well, currently I would have them now exposing Lias Andersson and Austin Wagner, both of whom have not had particularly great years so far, Anderson even finding himself off of the active roster for much of the season. But honestly, they could just as easily come from Lizotte or even potentially Grundstrom, and especially with Dustin Brown currently 3rd in team scoring and still having a year left on his contract, even though he is a bit of an older player and this team is more looking towards the future, I think that even one of those two spots could also find its way towards Dustin Brown, meaning that Lizotte could also be off this protection list. With that said though, considering all of these guys are on the younger end, other than Brown anyway, I still do think that it's pretty likely at this point that Seattle will be going with a young forward when it comes to picking from the Kings. The question then is which one? When it comes to that, well, at least at the moment, Grundstrom and Wagner are the only ones with contracts for next year, so they would seem like the most likely options, but at this point, it's really hard to say. On the defensive end for the Kings, once again, a couple of weeks ago, they did get Christian Wolanin from the Senators for Mike Amadio. And while Wolanin could potentially be a player that the Kraken could look at, if they are looking at the defensive end more from the Kings, I do still think that Olli Maatta is probably the more tempting option. One team that, at least as far as the expansion draft is concerned anyway, shook things up quite a bit over the last couple of days though, is the Calgary Flames. The Flames got things started the night before the deadline by trading Dave Riddick to Toronto for a 3rd round pick, and then followed that up the day of by dealing Sam Bennett to Florida for a 2nd round pick and Emil Heineman. Now, both Riddick and especially Bennett were players that I was even looking at as potential frontrunners for a potential selection by Seattle from the Flames. But with both of them gone now, another player that has been talked about quite a bit would be Dylan Dubé. But based on the season he's had so far, I think at this point it's much more likely that he ends up being protected. So then, at this point, to me anyway, the most interesting options for Seattle from the Flames would probably come down to Backlund, Glenn Godden, or potentially Oliver Killington on the defensive end. All in all, though, with both Bennett and Riddick out of the picture, this becomes a much less interesting team when it comes to the expansion draft. When it comes to the Vancouver Canucks, they were actually decently busy during the trade deadline, but the moves they made will likely have little to no impact on the expansion draft. Really, the only move that they made that could maybe have some effect on the expansion draft would be them acquiring Madison Bowie from the Blackhawks. A pretty good-sized right-shotted defenseman that, at least over the last couple of years anyway, has shown a little bit better of a playmaking ability in his game. He could end up maybe being on the radar as a potential player the Kraken look at from the Vancouver Canucks, but in the end, I still don't think he's probably a front-runner for being the selection. Easily the busiest team, though, during the trade deadline was the Chicago Blackhawks, although they too also got started a few days early when they traded a pair of Lucases in Wallmark and Carlson to the Florida Panthers for Riley Stillman and Brett Connolly. And then, of course, on the day itself, they acquired Adam Gaudette from the Canucks in exchange for Matthew Highmore, and also parted ways with Matthias Janmark, who went to Vegas as well as a 5th-round pick, for a 2nd-round pick in this year's draft and a 3rd-round pick in next year's. As far as the protection list is concerned, Lucas Wallmark is the only one I had protected, and I do think that Gaudette probably ends up taking that protection slot, so that makes things pretty quick and simple there. As far as the players that I think the Kraken could potentially be looking at, though, this definitely does thin out their options on the forward end when it comes to the Blackhawks, as at this point I pretty much think that Hagel and now Connolly are probably the only two tempting options on the forward end for the Kraken. Meanwhile, on the defensive end, Stillman kind of takes the place of Lucas Carlson as a potential younger option that the Kraken could go for, but I still think that if Nikita Zadorov is available, he's probably the best option. In Detroit, the Red Wings dealt Anthony Mantha to the Capitals for Jakub Vrana and Richard Panik. As far as the expansion draft is concerned, I'm not sure that this changes a whole lot for Detroit, as I think Vrana probably just takes Mantha's spot on the protection list, and I don't see Panik being particularly tempting for the Kraken to select. And then, of course, the biggest trade from the last 2 days with the Buffalo Sabres sending Taylor Hall and Curtis Lazar to the Bruins in exchange for Anders Bjork and a 2nd-round pick. As far as the impact that this trade has on the Sabres expansion draft outlook, I'll be doing the video specifically about them and that whole situation coming up here in the next couple of weeks, so I'm going to save that for then. But when it comes to the Bruins, well, I just did that video less than 2 weeks ago, and I don't think it's at all a stretch to say that this team is probably going to want to be protecting Taylor Hall, especially considering he's already looking for an extension from the Bruins after the trade. Now, Hall is set to be UFA at the end of the season, so whether or not the Bruins do give him an extension before the expansion draft, or try and extend him afterwards, or maybe just let him go to free agency, all remains to be seen. But assuming Hall does end up getting protected by the Bruins, that means he probably ends up taking that protection spot from either Jake DeBrusk, or to me, more likely, Ondrej Kase. Either one of which could very easily end up in Seattle if exposed. And while Curtis Lazar, the other part of this trade, is a pretty good player and a decent piece for a 3rd or 4th line, for the Bruins there are plenty of better options than Lazar, so I don't see him coming to Seattle. Now, there were plenty of other trades and maybe even a couple that could also have an impact on the expansion draft, especially when it comes to the Toronto Maple Leafs, for example. But as far as I'm concerned, these are the only ones that really impacted any of the teams that we've covered so far, and any ones that could have an impact on the expansion draft for the teams I haven't talked about, I'll just go over those when I get to those teams. So for now, that will do it for this one. If you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the trade deadline and what impact you think it could have on the expansion draft, and if you think I missed anything down in the comment section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.